Well, you've known about the subject for several days. Well, you've heard us talk about it. Yes, Betty's even mentioned it in her song. Well, let's talk about faith in the dark. History shows that humans can adapt to changing circumstances and situations even when we are under great pressure. Some of the best lessons of faith, courage, sacrifice, cooperation, valor, and devotion are lived and are learned during such experiences. But the passages from Job 23 and Psalm 22 show that faith comes under its greatest pressure when we cannot sense God's presence. As tough as things can get at times, we are somehow able to deal with it better by knowing that God is with us. But what about when we must walk through dark experiences and can't sense God's presence? We know life includes sorrows as well as joys. When we must walk through the dark valley of grief and sorrow, we want to sense God's presence. We know life includes sickness and disease as well as health and vitality. When we walk through the valley, that dark valley of fear, anxiety, and pain, we want to sense God's presence. We know life includes enemies and dangers as well as loving friends and family members. When our enemies attack and threaten to overcome us, we want to sense God's presence. We know that our journey includes the experience of dying as well as all the other experiences in living. When death approaches, we need to sense God's presence. But what happens to our faith when we can't? What does faith look, feel, and act like in the dark? What is our ministry with and to people who must endure suffering and pain along with what appears to be the deliberate silence of God? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me tell you a couple of things. The first is that faith in the dark is frustrated faith. The words we find at Job 23 are utterances from a crying and frustrated soul. Listen, today also my complaint is bitter. His hand is heavy despite my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his dwelling. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. And then at verse 7, the passage continues. There an upright person could reason with him, and I could be acquitted forever by my judge. But then we read these words, if I go forward, he is not there. Or backward, I cannot perceive him. On the left, he hides, and I cannot behold him. I turn to the right, but I cannot see him. And finally, at verse 17, we hear this anguished cry. If only I could vanish in darkness, and thick darkness could cover my face. It is as if Job is saying, if only I could do what God is doing. God appears to be invisible. If only I could disappear. The frustrating words of a suffering soul also come through plainly in the lesson from Psalm 22. We remember the first verse from Jesus' utterances at Calvary. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? From the words of my groaning. Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. Frustrated faith happens when we need to be comforted as only God can comfort us, but God is silent. Frustrated faith comes up from coming up empty after having resorted to our tried and trusted ways of seeking God, only to find God missing where we usually find Him or expect God to be. Frustrated faith comes from the time when God doesn't seem to vindicate us when we're standing in the gap and proclaiming our devotion to God. Frustrated faith comes from not knowing what God is doing with us, from feeling like God won't even hear our cries and pleas, and from knowing we can't do a thing about it. Frustrated faith isn't merely about feeling like God has put us on hold. It isn't about feeling like God has stepped out and left a message for us to use heavenly voicemail. Frustrated faith feels like we have called on God from the depth of our dark situations and experiences only to hear the phone ringing, 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 and nobody is answering. We know God is there. We know God knows we're calling. We know God knows we're suffering and calling about it, but God knows we're desperate to hear from God, but God won't pick up the phone. God is inexplicably silent, and that is frustrating. I don't care how holy you are. I don't care how much you love the Lord. I don't care how many psalms you know. I don't care how many prayers you know. I don't care how many songs you can sing. It is frustrating when you have put everything out there that all of your feelers out for God, and you get silence. It's hard enough to experience the kind of suffering that Job experienced. Family tragedies, business failures, what appears to be an incurable illness, and accusations from well-meaning friends about how you must have done something to deserve this because God wouldn't have put this all on you if you had been all that. But on top of all that, Job had to deal with a growing, dreadful feeling that God was ignoring and evading him. So what is a reverent soul to do with that kind of feeling? First, confess it. Confess it. Follow Job's example. Vent the anger and the frustration. Our complaints and our objections won't make God show up, but Job does show that we need to get stuff off our chest at times with God. I mean, God's not going to show up because we vent, but sometimes we need to get it off our chest. Sometimes we need to remember the words of that song. I must tell Jesus. Now, Jesus may not answer right now, but I got to tell him. You recall those conversations with loved ones where you did not really expect the loved one to do anything, did not really expect the loved one to care about you, but you need to talk to somebody, and you need to tell them. It's a lie. The headache of our life is that we sometimes believe we've got to make it look like we're okay with the way God is dealing with us when we're really not. We're really not. Guess what? God can handle it. God can handle it. The grace of God can handle us being really honest about our frustration. God, this hurts. God, may I use the colloquial? This sucks. God, I don't know where you are, and I don't like not knowing. Sometimes we need to know that we can complain about God's silence. Yes, we can complain about it. Yes, we can object to it. We can do all of that and still be faithful. For faithfulness isn't always comfortable. It isn't always cordial. It isn't always polite. Sometimes the honest response of a faithful heart when God seems to be purposely silent is, I don't like this and I want you to know about it. Job's comments show us that we can admit our bitter frustration when God is inexplicably silent. The frustration must be admitted because it's real. It is undeniable. It's inescapable. God can handle our honest frustration. Our honest frustration isn't a sign that our faith is weak or gone. It's proof that our faith is frustrated and that faith is frustrating. And frustrated faith is sometimes the only faith we can live in the dark. Sometimes the only faith we can live is faith that angrily and bitterly cries, my God, why have you forsaken me? And when faithful people are going through such experiences, they need our encouragement and they need our understanding. They don't need for us to go holy on them and start belittling their sufferings and their frustrations. They don't need for us to go tell them, honey, you need to have more faith than that. They're having faith. They're exercising faith. They're practicing their faith. My God is a prayer to God. That's a faith response. They need for us to lovingly listen and lovingly give them venting room and lovingly share their frustration and their pain. They are in the dark. They are frustrated because God is inexplicably silent about their suffering. In that painful place, they need us to be instruments of tenderness and compassion. People around us will experience pain so great and frustrating that they will cry like Job, if only I could vanish in darkness and thick darkness could cover my face. When that happens, we who are with them in their dark place, but have a little light of our own, needs to let our little light shine. So they'll realize that their darkness isn't all that there is. We must not add to their darkness by making them feel guilty about their honest frustration. And the last thing I'll tell you is, faith in the dark means that we don't stop calling, believing, and trusting God. It's tempting when people don't return our calls to stop calling. You understand? You call somebody, leave a message. You call somebody, hey, I called you, left a message on your voicemail, haven't heard from you. You call somebody, did you get my messages? Then you email them, I called you 3 times and I haven't heard from you. I'm sending an email message. Did you get my messages? Nothing. It's tempting when people don't respond to stop calling. But remember what the song says, yield not to temptation. Don't yield to that temptation in the dark times of faith. Even when he was in the depth of his frustration and anger about God's inexplicable silence, Job held on to enough faith to continue trusting God. Listen, but he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall come out like gold. All the old preachers could go wonderful word on that. And then at verse 15, for he will complete what he appoints for me, and many such things are in his mind. The message there is, God has something in mind. God will complete what is on God's mind. I don't understand it, but I trust God to work it through. Despite the feeling of the psalmist at Psalm 22 of being forsaken, we read these words at verses 2 through 5. Yet you are holy. This is the same voice that says, my God, why have you forsaken me in verse 1? But quickly goes to, yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our ancestors trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. Their message is a defiant affirmation of God's trustworthiness despite the fact of God's inexplicable silence and their frustration concerning it. They affirm that God is good and just and trustworthy even in our frustration and pain. They declare that God's silence is painful, but God is still present. God's silence is painful, but God is still up to something with them. God's silence is painful, but they will not quit trusting and loving God. Beloved, when life turns dark and God is inexplicably silent, remember that silence doesn't mean non-existence. Silence doesn't mean unconcern. Silence doesn't mean absence. Silence doesn't mean disapproval. Divine silence during our seasons of darkness may be part of God's process of producing something in and from us that would not be produced otherwise. Perhaps it is that God can only get something out of us, through us, and worked out with us by being silent. Even when that silence is terribly frustrating and painful for us. What are you saying, preacher? I'm saying that God is working even when God is silent. God is working even when we are frustrated about God being silent. God is working even when life around us is dark. God is working even when we don't understand God's work or our place in it. Dr. Gardner Taylor has been an inspiring preacher for many people across his long ministry. He's now in his mid-90s. Dr. Taylor and the first Mrs. Taylor, Laura, were guests in our home some years ago and met our sons when the congregation where I was then serving invited him to preach for a church anniversary. But their long and inspiring marriage ended tragically when Laura Taylor died after being struck by a truck while crossing a New York street. After she died, Dr. Taylor returned to preach a second time at Emmanuel Baptist Church where I was serving. As we drove to the airport for his return flight to New York, he admitted his painful grief and spoke honestly about how he dealt with God about it. I will never forget his words. Doc said, I told God I do not like this. I said, I cannot see any way that this is good or how you will get any good out of this. But if there is a way for you to get good out of this, I will go through it. I do not like this. I cannot see any way that this is good or how you will get any good out of this. But if there is a way for you to get good out of it, I will go through it. Gardner Taylor said to God, I will continue calling and hoping and trusting you, even though I don't understand what's happening and don't like what's happening and don't like not understanding it and don't like you not telling me what it means. Gardner Taylor told God, I don't like this, but I'm yours. If there is any way for you to be glorified by this darkness, I will trust you, even if I don't understand it. As the old folks said, children, that's faith in the dark.